On June 25, 1978, Argentina won its first World Cup. 70,000 people screamed inside Estadio Monumental. Millions celebrated in the streets. The country exploded with joy. But 700 meters away, inside a Navy building called ESMA, prisoners who could barely stand were forced to watch the match beside the men torturing them. When Argentina scored, the torturers kissed the prisoners on the cheeks. "We won," they said, and the prisoners had to cheer. This is the World Cup a dictator stole, and the tournament FIFA has spent decades trying to forget. On June 1, 1978, General Jorge Rafael Videla stood at the center of Argentina's national stadium and opened what he called the World Cup for Peace. The phrase was grotesque because Argentina was not at peace. 2 years earlier, the military had overthrown the democratic government. Then the disappearances began. Students, teachers, journalists, artists, union leaders, anyone considered dangerous to the regime. People vanished in the middle of the night. No trials, no explanations, no bodies. By the time the World Cup started, somewhere between 15 and 30,000 people had already disappeared. And still, FIFA stayed. Not only stayed, celebrated. FIFA President João Havelange stood beside Videla, smiling for cameras, while the dictatorship transformed the World Cup into the greatest propaganda campaign in Argentine history. Because the junta understood something terrifying, football could distract the entire world. And it worked. The center of that darkness was a place called ESMA, the Navy Mechanics School, a detention and torture center operating in the middle of Buenos Aires. From its rooftop, you could practically see the World Cup stadium, 8 minutes walking distance. That was the distance between celebration and annihilation. Inside ESMA, prisoners were beaten, electrocuted, waterboarded, raped, and psychologically destroyed. Pregnant women were kept alive only long enough to give birth. Then they were murdered. Their babies were handed to military families and raised under false identities. Hundreds of children disappeared that way. And during the World Cup, the torture never stopped. Survivors later described televisions being brought into detention areas so prisoners could watch Argentina's matches beside the guards torturing them. Imagine that image. Blindfolded prisoners, broken bodies, the sound of screaming fans outside, the smell of blood inside the building. Then Argentina scores, and suddenly the torturers celebrate with their victims, forcing them to clap, forcing them to smile, forcing them to participate in the illusion. One survivor later wrote, "If they won, we lost." Because every victory made the dictatorship stronger. And while the world watched football, people continued disappearing. During the 25 days of the World Cup, at least 50 people vanished. 9 of them were pregnant women. Some were abducted near the stadium itself. Meanwhile, the mothers of Plaza de Mayo marched through Buenos Aires carrying photographs of their missing children, white scarves on their heads, names embroidered into fabric, begging the world to notice. Almost nobody did. Football was louder than the screams. That was the genius of the dictatorship. They didn't need the world to support them. They only needed the spectacle to distract them. And FIFA helped make that possible. The tournament itself became a machine of image control. Luxury hotels, cleaned streets, perfect television broadcasts, massive PR campaigns. Foreign journalists saw beautiful stadiums and passionate fans. They weren't shown the torture centers operating minutes away. The blindness wasn't accidental. It was engineered. And then came the match that still smells suspicious nearly 50 years later. Argentina versus Peru. Argentina needed to win by at least 4 goals to reach the final ahead of Brazil. The match ended 6-0. To this day, many believe the game was fixed. There has never been definitive proof, but the accusations never disappeared. Rumors of bribery, political pressure, secret negotiations between dictatorships. Even Peru's goalkeeper was born in Argentina. Whether the match was manipulated or not almost became irrelevant, because the appearance of corruption was already overwhelming, and the dictatorship understood exactly what was at stake. Winning the World Cup would legitimize the regime internationally. Football had become political weaponry. Years later, several Argentine players admitted they felt used. Osvaldo Ardiles said, "We were propaganda." Ricardo Villa later recalled hearing gunshots near the team hotel while the tournament continued around them, and still, almost nobody spoke publicly. Not even Cesar Luis Menotti. Argentina's coach was openly left-wing and personally opposed the dictatorship, but he stayed silent. And that silence mattered, because dictatorships don't need universal support to survive. They only need enough silence. That's the terrifying part. The regime didn't control football through force alone. It controlled football through fear, through distraction, through emotional hypnosis, and the world accepted it because the football was beautiful. That's what makes Argentina 1978 so disturbing. The goals were real. The joy was real. The passion was real. But so was the horror. And somehow, the two existed simultaneously. One of the most horrifying details involved the stolen children. Hundreds of babies born to imprisoned women were secretly taken and given to military families. Many grew up without knowing their real names, without knowing their real parents had been murdered. Even today, decades later, some are still being identified through DNA testing. Think about that. A World Cup happened while children were literally being stolen by the state. And FIFA has never formally acknowledged any responsibility for helping provide the cover that made it easier. Not once. No apology. No official reckoning. Nothing. Because admitting the truth would force FIFA to admit something catastrophic: that the World Cup can function as propaganda. Not accidentally, systematically. And once you understand Argentina 1978, you start seeing the same blueprint everywhere. Russia 2018, Qatar 2022, Brazil 2014. Different countries. Same structure. Ignore the criticism. Focus on the spectacle. Flood the media with emotion. Keep the cameras inside the stadium. Keep the uncomfortable truths outside the frame. Argentina didn't invent sports washing. It perfected it. And FIFA helped normalize it. That's why this story matters so much. Not because a dictatorship hosted a World Cup, but because the tournament worked exactly the way the dictatorship hoped it would. The world looked at football instead of looking at the disappeared, and even today, FIFA still refuses to fully confront what happened. Videla died in prison. Several torturers from ESMA were eventually convicted. But FIFA never stood up and said, "We were wrong," because saying that would threaten the mythology surrounding the World Cup itself. The idea that football exists outside politics, outside power, outside propaganda. But Argentina 1978 destroyed that illusion forever. Because if a World Cup can help distract the world from mass murder, then every modern tournament deserves a second look. And maybe that's the most disturbing part of all. The mechanism never disappeared. It just became more sophisticated. Now the World Cup returns to the Americas again in 2026. New stadiums, new sponsors, new promises, billions in projected revenue. And once again, FIFA insists football is only about unity and celebration. But now, you know the architecture behind the spectacle. Sell the emotion. Control the narrative. Silence the uncomfortable questions. Count the money. That pattern began long before modern football. But Argentina, 1978, proved how powerful it could become. Because football doesn't just entertain. In the wrong hands, it can hypnotize. And if the world once ignored torture camps sitting beside a World Cup stadium, what do you think modern tournaments are distracting you from right now? If this story changed how you see football, subscribe to The B-Side of Football. Because every episode here uncovers another layer hidden beneath the version they sold you. And the deeper you look, the darker the game becomes.